In this video I'd like to talk to you about Rumpelstiltskin. You see, I've always had a sneaking sympathy for Rumpelstiltskin and I could never quite work out why. It was something to do with this ugly, ill-favoured little man hopping up and down with rage when his hopes were thwarted. So I gave it some thought and came up with a few things that I thought might be of interest to you also. The story of Rumpelstiltskin starts with the miller. The miller is a bit of a boastful guy, and somehow he gets in front of the king and he says to the king, "I've got a daughter who can spin straw into gold." Well, the king is apparently a man who is a bit of a greedy man, and so he says to the miller, "Bring your daughter to me." And the miller goes home, and you'd think that he'd think, "God, what have I done now? I have to protect my daughter." But no, he doesn't. Instead, he carts his daughter off to see the king. And one thing that's really interesting about this story is the miller's daughter never has a name. She's not even that important. She's the daughter, the girl, and in time, as we all know, she becomes the queen. Anyway, the girl is taken off to see the king, and she doesn't try to say, "Look, Dad was boasting a bit, he was out of order and I can't do this stuff." She just sits there, and the king says to her, "Right, now you'll spin straw into gold for me." And she says, "I can't." So he throws her into a room because she hasn't given him any reason to understand that she can't do it. He throws her into a room, locks the door behind her and says, "I'll kill you if you don't succeed." And the girl sits there, "Oh, how could this happen to me? It's so hard, I don't know what to do." And lo and behold, this ill-favoured, ugly little man appears out of nowhere and asks her what the problem is. So the girl explains the problem, and Rumpelstiltskin says, "Well, I can do that, but what will you give me if I do?" Now here's the thing. I think that Rumpelstiltskin actually had a kind heart. He was an ugly, ill-favoured little person. He hadn't had a good upbringing. He hadn't learnt to be socially adept. But he did know, he had learnt from long experience, that you need to get something in return for what you give, or people will just take advantage of you. So he asks the girl, "What will you give me?" And she says, "I'll give you my necklace." And think about this for a moment. She was the miller's daughter. She hardly had a diamond necklace. It was presumably just a token for Rumpelstiltskin to know that he was getting some acknowledgement for what he was doing for her. So he sat down, spun the straw into gold, and the next morning the king comes along, looks at what's happened and thinks, "Hey, this is good." So, being the kind of greedy king he was, he takes the girl off to a bigger room the next night and says, "Right, spin this straw into gold for me." And again slams the door and locks it behind her, and she sits there again, "Oh, how am I going to do this? I got lucky last night, oh." And again Rumpelstiltskin appears. And she explains the problem to him, and again he says, "I can help you, what will you give me?" So she offers him the ring of her finger. Again, I don't imagine it was a huge diamond or anything, but it was a token. He needed a token to understand that she appreciated what he was doing for her. And he sat down and spun the straw into gold again. And the next morning the king came along and thought, "Hey, this is really good." And being the greedy devil he was, the next night he took her to an even bigger room with even more straw and said, "Spin this into gold," and thought to himself, "If she does this, I'll marry her." Now, this takes a little bit of thinking about. The king had threatened to kill her if she didn't spin the straw into gold in the first place, And then he decides he'll marry the girl, who we don't even know whether she's attractive, just because she's a good source of gold. So again, the girl sits there, oh, it's even worse tonight, how will I ever manage? And Rumpelstiltskin appears for the third time. And again, he knows he can solve her problem. He offers to solve her problem, and he says to her, what will you give me? Now, the girl could have thought about it and said, this guy has helped me out twice already when I was in difficulties, and he's come into my life again when I most need him. What can I offer him? I don't have any more jewellery, but I could offer him my friendship and my respect and my loyalty and my undying gratitude. She doesn't think like that. Being the miller's daughter, she is quite cheerful, really, about making promises that she may not be able to keep. So she says, well, you can have my firstborn child. And again, this is not really a very nice person who's already volunteering to give up a child she doesn't have in order to get the gold spun. But Rumpelstiltskin thinks, wow, what can I have in return for my gift? He has nobody, and he suddenly thinks, I could have this girl's son, or this child. Wow. So he sits there and spins the straw into gold, and the next morning the king comes along, opens the door, sees the pile of gold and thinks, I love her, I'm going to marry her. An interesting basis for a marriage, but there we go. So the two marry, and as the story goes, they lived very, very happily together. And in the fullness of time, that is 1 year, she produced a child. Now, she'd completely forgotten all about the promise she made to Rumpelstiltskin because she was so busy queening and generally having a nice time. So it came as a terrible shock to her when Rumpelstiltskin appeared to her and said, hey, you know, you made a bargain with me. I would like you to honour your bargain. And she goes, oh, it's just too terrible, I can't do this, because she was someone who was rather given to catastrophising. And Rumpelstiltskin, and this is what makes me think he had a kind heart, gave her a chance. He didn't say, a deal's a deal, you know, and I want the baby. He said, I'll tell you what, if you can guess my name, you keep your child. He knew he was in with a good chance, but nevertheless he left that window of opportunity open for her, and he gave her 3 nights. The first night she failed dismally and it was all catastrophising around the cradle. The second night she failed dismally, but she had a servant follow him back to his place. And there he was, dancing around the fire and singing to himself, tonight I brew and tomorrow I bake, because the Queen's child I take, or some such thing. So he was a homebody as well. He even wanted to make it nice for the child. But he also sang his name, and the servant went back to the palace and told the Queen the name. And when Rumpelstiltskin came the next night, she played with him. She tried to tease him a little bit. Is your name Ethelred? Is it Humongous Bottom? And he said, no, no, of course it isn't. And then she said, is it Rumpelstiltskin? And he was so frustrated and angry and upset that he apparently drove his right foot so far into the ground that to free himself, he tore off his left leg and disappeared forever. And they all lived happily ever after. The people who'd broken their promises, the people who had married for money, the people who had told lies and not thought about his feelings. Rumpelstiltskin did not get his needs met because he didn't know how to get people to respond to him in the way he wanted. He couldn't ask successfully. Don't let that happen to you.